Hi, everybody. I'm really glad to have this opportunity to present research Tom Novak and I are doing, taking a look at mechanisms, processes we can use to understand artificial intelligence. So in the 15 minutes or so that I have this afternoon, I want to talk about how we can understand AI, present our conceptual framework for thinking about how we can do this, and then share with you some preliminary studies. And I want to say we've been thinking about this topic for since I think middle of last year, and we've finally had some chance to start developing the model and running lots of studies. So what I'm going to share with you now is just sort of an illustrative study from each section to give you an idea of what we're working on. So first, in terms of how we can understand AI, clearly we could use anthropomorphism as a process to help us understand consumers' perceptions of AI. And as you're undoubtedly aware, anthropomorphism is an inductive process. It's an inductive inference process where people attribute to non-humans characteristics that are distinctly human, particularly, for example, the capacity for agency and the capacity for experience. And because people have an innate tendency to anthropomorphize, the literature and in practical applications has made it very clear that marketers use anthropomorphism quite a bit to increase adoption and usage and to render consumers more susceptible to marketing influences. Now, because AI-powered smart objects, what I'll just call smart objects, for the rest of the talk, are readily anthropomorphized, human-centric anthropomorphism is an obvious process for understanding AI. And in fact, there's already quite a bit of emerging research taking a look at how people anthropomorphize artificial intelligence. But what I want to suggest to you today is what if this natural tendency to anthropomorphize AI is actually a barrier? And in fact, more than 50 years ago, McDermott was a computer scientist in MIT. He had recommended that for the field to progress, people should avoid referring to AI using what he called wishful mnemonics, which would imply that we could somehow AI could understand. And instead, we should use sanitized technical descriptions and just try to limit ourselves to referring to AI's intrinsic properties. And in fact, more recently, Max Tegmark is a physicist at MIT. He has suggested that promoting these anthropomorphic understandings of AI typically is, the evil Cylon or Terminator versus the benevolent Data from Star Trek, that these kinds of sort of cultural touchstones for science fiction, they're sending us down the wrong path. And Nick Bostrom, who's a philosopher at Oxford, has argued similarly, but from a different direction, suggesting that anthropomorphizing artificial intelligence is actually one of the biggest obstacles that's in the way of our understanding how AI might impact the world in the future. And so research now is starting to catch up with this idea, and recent research is suggesting that anthropomorphizing AI might not even be in our best interest. There's research on how it can lead consumers astray when they're making financial decisions. There's some interesting research of how firms have incentive to mislead consumers, for example, in these chatbot contexts. And people even overtrust rescue robots when they're anthropomorphized, trust them to lead them out of emergencies because they are anthropomorphized. And so that leads us to start to think about this idea of, is AI somehow undermined through anthropomorphic metaphor? And in fact, we're going to argue that if we want to build trust in consumers' interactions with artificial intelligence, it has to be calibrated based on user experience with the actual system, not from feelings or perceptions that might arise from anthropomorphizing the system. And so we need some way to understand what AI is doing that don't rely on human-centric interpretations. And so let me share with you sort of very briefly how we're thinking about how we're conceptualizing this problem. If you look in industry, the current efforts focus on anthropomorphizing AI in order to promote trust. And the example I have here is this Jaguar Land Rover autonomous vehicle. They have created this vehicle that makes eye contact in order to generate trust. And so we're trying to get consumers to trust autonomous vehicles, robots, chatbots, you name it, by anthropomorphizing it. And the idea is if consumers are crossing the street or pedestrians crossing the street and they see this and the eyes look like they're looking toward the consumer, maybe the pedestrian would be more likely to trust that it'd be safe to cross the road. But there's another approach. And in that approach, we could train people for the AI future. And so Andrew Ng, for example, argues that instead of trying to make the road, instead of trying to get consumers to change their behavior, instead of trying to get change the AI to make consumers change their behavior, we need to actually change the people. We need to train people so that the road is safer for the autonomous vehicles. And more generally, sort of we're going to roll with this idea and suggest that we actually need to train people so that they understand what they're really interacting with and they'll be more likely to trust it. And so our practically the question is, would this work better if we're then trying to get people to trust AI by anthropomorphizing it? Instead, maybe we get people to think about AI from a different perspective. And so that's in fact exactly what we're going to do. We're going to adopt an object-oriented versus a human-centric approach. In the human-centric approach, we filter our perceptions of AI through human-centric metaphors, so meaning we reference AI to our own properties and capacities. The advantage of doing this, obviously, is we're really good at this. Humans are good at this. It's natural, maybe even innate to do this, and smart objects really lend themselves to anthropomorphism. The harder approach, which we think could really pay some dividends, is to metaphorize AI using non-human-centric metaphors. And so the idea here is to allow us to examine the experience of the smart object, but relative to its own properties and capacities, whatever those might be, hopefully rendering it more transparent. And so our research question is, will OO, object-oriented metaphors, influence experiences of AI and responses to AI compared to anthropomorphic metaphor? And in this general conceptual model, I've just sketched this out here, there's this idea that we can manipulate the metaphor. We think this metaphor is going to have implications for trust and then eventually some downstream outcomes. But this will be moderated by your expertise with AI. So I think it's going to be really important how long you've used these devices, how knowledgeable you are about them, how much experience you've had with them, and so on. But in addition, there's going to be two components of experience that are important, because metaphor can influence the situational experience we have with these devices. For example, the uses we might predict for the devices, and then what roles we think are adopted in those uses. And then we think that's going to lead to an overall sort of gestalt or holistic experience of what is my relational role with AI. For example, do I see it more as a partner, or do I see it more as a servant? And we think that's going to moderate some of these downstream outcomes as a consequence of trust. So that's sort of our general framework. And these are all and we're doing quite a few studies to sort of break this apart. I'm only going to share with you in the time I have left, examples of each of the studies in each of these sections. So first, I want to share a study, and we've run a number of these, but I'm just going to show you one. That we can, demonstrate we are able to manipulate the metaphors we use to describe artificial intelligence, and that in fact can stimulate an object-oriented versus anthropomorphic process. And the example we'll use in what I'm going to share today is on the Amazon Echo. In the second study, I'm going to show that the metaphor actually impacts these uses and relational roles. And then in the third study, I'm going to show that this can impact some of these downstream consequences, in this case, privacy concerns that could be heightened or attenuated depending on whether the device is seen as object-oriented or anthropomorphized, and also depending on whether you're an owner or a non-owner. So first, let's take a look at the first study, operationalizing object-oriented metaphor. Here's just one approach. We have several of these because we're doing quite a few studies to sort of break down this idea of how to train consumers to generate these OO metaphors. And in this approach, we're looking at how AI sees. And so we have taken AI-generated diagrams of common household objects, and we've got those from reverse engineering neural network models that have been trained on photographs from ImageNet categories. And so the figure you see here is literally how AI sees a hairdryer. We can compare that to, for example, we could argue that how the human sees the hairdryer is more photorealistic, as the picture you see here, compared to how AI sees the hairdryer. And so if we want one way to manipulate AI would be to have actual photos represent the anthropomorphism and have the AI generated diagrams represent object-oriented metaphor. And so in the study setup, we had 201 subjects, and we randomly assigned them to the anthropomorphic or the object-oriented metaphor condition. We asked them to read a description of the new Amazon Echo Show with a front-facing camera, and then they elaborated on how Alexa either sees similarly to humans, that was the anthropomorphic condition, or how the Amazon Echo sees differently from humans in the object-oriented condition. And I have some description here of different things that were emphasized in the text, and then subjects wrote some description to elaborate. And here's some examples of the text. I'm not going to have time to go into that. And so the dependent variable in this case, to see if we could actually train people to think in an OO versus anthropomorphic perspective, was to ask them which image comes closest to capturing what this Amazon Echo device likely sees. And so the hypothesis is if you're in the object-oriented condition, you should be more likely to choose the AI diagram than participants in the anthropomorphic condition. But if you're in the anthropomorphic condition, you should be more likely to choose the actual photo than participants in the object-oriented condition. And then, in fact, that's exactly what we find. And the effect is strong, and we've been able to replicate this with different images and even different wordings of these manipulations. So we're pretty excited that this at least represents one way we can stimulate these different metaphors. In addition, we would like to be able to have a scale rather than always using these images to capture this. And so we've been developing a scale of anthropomorphism versus object-oriented, a bipolar scale. It has 8 items, has a pretty good alpha, and it tries to tap some of these different aspects that, for example, it has its own unique human characteristics. It's like its own thing, but it's not a human thing. It has its own unique non-human perspective. Those are some of the examples on the object-oriented side. And we also have a sort of a standard anthropomorphism scale, and in addition, a unipolar object-oriented scale that we develop. And I'm going to skip this. And as you can see, the differences in the means in the experimental conditions are significant. Let me drop my head down there. And you can see clearly that the best effects, the strongest effects are on the bipolar scale, but all the scales are giving the differences in the predicted direction. We went ahead and fit some mediation models, and we get a partial mediation with the bipolar scale, but the unipolar scales do not mediate. And so we're feeling pretty good that we're on the right direction with some of these ideas. And so it's pretty clear that manipulating these metaphors can stimulate an object-oriented versus anthropomorphic process. Now, if we take a look at exploring uses and roles, I'm not done analyzing this, but I want to present some of the initial results of this. We had a 2x2 design. We had an OO versus anthropomorphic metaphor manipulated, as in the study I just showed you. And then we had a measured factor of owner versus non-owner. And we asked people to come up with 5 different uses of the Amazon Echo. And then we asked for each of these uses for people to evaluate the role the Echo plays in its relationship with them, whether it's a partner or whether it's a servant. And then these uses were objectively coded into mutually exclusive categories. This is the only part that I have to share today, but you can see in the scatter plot of object-oriented, role by metaphor, you can see that consumers are clearly generating different uses and roles for the Amazon Echo depending on the metaphor. So the anthropomorphic metaphor stimulates uses that tend to cast the Echo in a partner role. I think it's something we might expect. Whereas the OO metaphor stimulates uses that are not only distinct from the anthropomorphic metaphor, but also tend to represent the Amazon Echo in more of a servant role. And we'll have more to say about that as our research progresses. And then in the final study I want to share with you, I want to take a look at the impact of privacy perceptions. And so if we look at the privacy consequences, we ran factor 1 is similar to the manipulations that I shared earlier of OO versus anthropomorphic. We had another measured factor of ownership, and the DV in this case was a privacy DV, where we asked, how much would it bother you to learn that the Amazon Echo records your conversations, even if you don't say the wake word? And in fact, this is exactly something that the Amazon Echo does. And we get no main effects for metaphor or ownership. And we have a significant interaction. And if we take a look and see what that looks like, you can see that non-owners are more likely to be bothered than owners when the AI is object-oriented, but owners are more likely to be bothered when the AI is anthropomorphized. And in fact, I can show it here. So we get these interesting reversals on these trust betrayals. And so I think that's I set my timer, so I'm pretty much right on time. And so I think this is really exciting and really provocative. And what we're doing now is we're in the lab running lots of studies to try to fill in the blanks on our conceptual model, understand the processes underlying these effects, and we are pretty interested, pretty excited about looking at these different metaphors that we can use to stimulate consumer perceptions of AI and the impact that those might have on trust, as well as some important downstream marketing consequences. So thank you very much. I hope you're having a great time at ACR, and feel free to reach out if you have any questions or want to talk about this further. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.